Mud coated the back of my throat. It tasted of crushed worms and old iron, a gritty reminder that I was crawling like an animal just to survive one. My lungs burned. Every inhale felt like dragging shattered glass over my ribs. I kept low, pressing my spine against the rough, moss-eaten stones of the keep's outer wall. Above me, the harvest moon was a bloated, sickly yellow, illuminating the rain that sliced through the courtyard. I was going to die tonight. That was the only certainty my brain could process. From the great hall, the howling had already begun. It wasn't the majestic, haunting sound the bards sang about in the taverns of the lowlands. It was a wet, guttural tearing of vocal cords, the sound of joints popping, spines elongating, and humanity being violently shoved aside for the beast. It was the night of the blood moon, the night the Alpha King chose his tribute, me. I was the tribute. A bureaucratic oversight, a poorly timed trip to the market, a wrong look at a border guard, and suddenly my life was forfeit to a treaty signed 100 years before I was born. My knees hit the cobblestones, tearing through the thin wool of my dress. I didn't feel it. Adrenaline is a magnificent liar. It tells you that you are faster, stronger, and more invisible than you actually are. I scrambled around the corner, my bare hands slipping on horse dung and wet hay. The stables. If I could just get to the tree line, past the outer gates, the rain would wash away my scent. That's what the older women in the village always whispered. Water is the wolf's blindfold. I prayed they weren't just spouting old wives' tales. The stables smelled intensely of warm leather, damp oat straw, and the sharp ammonia tang of horse urine. It was a deeply grounding smell. Real. Safe. I slipped through the heavy wooden doors, my chest heaving, listening to the chaotic symphony of the beasts tearing the great hall apart in their revelry. Then I saw it. Sitting in the shadows of the rear stalls was a carriage, not a simple wagon, but a heavy, imposing thing built of dark, polished oak and reinforced with thick bands of black iron. It wasn't hitched to any horses, but it looked ready. The doors were shut, the velvet curtains drawn tight behind the glass. It looked abandoned, tucked away, while the groomsmen were undoubtedly getting drunk in the kitchens to drown out the screams. The barking started. Not inside the hall, but out in the courtyard. The hounds, regular dogs, but bred for tracking. They had my scent. Panic, cold, and sharp as a butcher's knife twisted in my gut. I couldn't outrun dogs. My ankle was already throbbing from a bad landing off the servants' stairs. I threw myself at the carriage door. The brass handle was freezing. It turned with a heavy, oiled click. I hoisted myself up the metal step, biting into my bare arch, and tumbled inside, just as the stable doors rattled behind me in the wind. I pulled the door shut, ensuring the latch caught without a sound. Pitch black. The inside of the carriage was an absolute void. I scrambled blindly onto the floorboards, curling my knees to my chest, making myself as small as humanly possible. I dragged a heavy pile of fabric, a wool blanket, or a thick cloak, I couldn't tell, over my shivering body. Outside, a man shouted. A lantern's weak yellow light bled through the tiny cracks in the carriage doors. "Check the stalls," a gruff voice barked. Bootsteps sloshed through the mud. The dogs were whining a frantic, high-pitched sound. "The king will have our heads on pikes if he finds out the human girl bolted before the claiming." I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my dirty hands over my mouth. My own pulse beat a frantic, sick rhythm against my teeth. I smelled blood. I had bitten my own lip so hard it was bleeding. "Nothing here," another voice yelled. "Bring the hounds toward the armory. She might have slipped through the grating." The voices faded. The lantern light vanished. I let out a shaky breath, the air whistling through my teeth. I was safe. For the next 10 minutes, I was safe. I just needed to wait until the hunting party moved to the lower village. Then I would make a break for the forest. But then the carriage jolted. I slammed my head against the wooden seat above me, biting back a yelp. The entire frame groaned. Outside, the heavy stomping of hooves echoed against the cobblestones. Someone was hitching horses to the front. No, I blindly reached for the door handle in the dark, my fingers frantically brushing against the tufted velvet of the walls. I had to get out. If they took this carriage into the courtyard, I'd be surrounded by wolves. "Hurry it up, Thomas," a voice yelled from the driver's box. "He wants to leave now. The border dispute won't wait for his hangover." Leave the keep." My hand froze on the brass latch. If this carriage was leaving the keep, it was going past the gates, past the guards, past the tree line. It was my way out. It was a free ride out of hell. I sank back to the floorboards, pulling the heavy wool cloak tighter around my shoulders. The floor was hard, but it was dry. The carriage lurched forward violently, throwing my shoulder into the wooden base of the opposite seat. The iron-rimmed wheels began to grind against the stones, a deafening rhythmic clatter that drowned out the howling of the keep. I closed my eyes. The exhaustion finally hit me. It wasn't a gentle fading. It was a physical collapse, like a building giving way. Every muscle in my legs began to twitch and cramp. The cold soaked into my bones, mixing with the dampness of my ruined dress. But I was moving. Away. I focused on the smell of the carriage. It was rich, leather-polished dried lavender, and something else. Something heavy and metallic, like copper, left out in the sun, mixed with the deep, earthy scent of pine needles and crushing snow. It was a terrifyingly specific smell, but I was too exhausted to parse why it made the hairs on my arms stand up. I drifted, not into sleep, but into a numb, dissociative state. The carriage swayed. The rain beat against the roof in a steady drumming rhythm. Then something shifted in the dark. It wasn't the sway of the carriage. It was a deliberate, heavy movement. Leather creaking. My heart stopped completely. I froze, not even daring to let my lungs expand. A foot, a large, heavy boot, nudged against my knee in the dark. I wasn't alone. The carriage hit a rut in the road, sending a violent shudder through the cabin. The boot rested heavily against my shin. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat had seized, locking the air in my lungs until my vision began to swim with dark, sparkling spots. Someone was sitting on the bench right above me. They had been sitting there the entire time, while I threw myself inside, while I scrambled on the floor, while I pulled their cloak over my head. The smell, pine needles crushing snow and hot copper. My brain, slow and sluggish from terror, finally connected the sensory dots. It wasn't just a smell. It was an aura, a physical weight in the air that pushed against my skin. It was the scent of a predator at rest. "You are bleeding," a voice said. It didn't come from the front of the carriage. It came from the shadows directly above my head. The voice was low, rough, and vibrating with an exhausting kind of authority. It sounded like stones grinding together at the bottom of a deep well. I scrambled backward like a crab, my bare heels kicking against the floorboards, until my spine slammed into the opposite door. I tore the cloak away from my face, gasping for air, staring into the pitch blackness. "Don't claw at the door," the voice murmured. There was no anger in it, only a profound, bone-deep weariness. "It's locked from the outside, a security measure by my paranoid captain of the guard." Lightning flashed a brief, jagged tear of white light that flooded the cabin through the small window. In that fraction of a second, I saw him. He was slouched against the tufted leather cushions, one long leg stretched out the other, bent with his arm resting lazily across his knee. He wasn't wearing a crown or royal armor. He wore a simple dark linen shirt, unlaced at the throat, and heavy riding leathers. But I knew the face. Every human in the territories knew the face on the silver coins. Gideon, the Alpha King. The man I had just spent the last hour breaking half my toes to escape. The darkness snapped back, swallowing him whole. My stomach heaved. I literally dry heaved my hands, clutching my stomach as a sour, metallic taste flooded my mouth. I hadn't eaten in 2 days, which was the only thing that saved me from vomiting all over his polished boots. I waited for the growl. I waited for the hands to reach down and snap my neck or drag me up by my hair. I waited to be torn apart for the insult of hiding in his private sanctuary. Instead, I heard the soft pop of a cork, the clinking of glass. "Drink?" he asked. I stared into the void, my chest rising and falling in erratic, jerky spasms. Was this a game werewolves loved games? They loved the chase. No, I choked out. My voice sounded pathetic, thin and reedy like a dying bird. "Suit yourself." I heard him swallow a long, deep pull of liquid. "It's terrible anyway. Tastes like fermented mud, but it numbs the headache." I pressed my hands flat against the cold wooden floor, trying to ground myself. My mind was spinning violently. Why was he in here? The great hall was full of his pack celebrating his blood right. The human tribute me was supposed to be dragged before him at midnight. Yet here he was, hiding in the dark, drinking bad wine, in a moving carriage, headed away from his own stronghold. "You're shaking," he observed. His voice was closer now. He had leaned forward. "I'm not," I lied. My teeth literally clicked together as I said it. He sighed. It was a heavy, incredibly human sound. Not a snarl, just the exhale of a man who was deeply, thoroughly annoyed with his current situation. "You're dripping blood and rainwater onto a rug that is older than your bloodline," Gideon said softly. "And you are shaking so violently I can feel the vibrations through the floorboards. Do not lie to me in this carriage. I have had my fill of liars tonight." I swallowed hard. "Are you going to kill me?" "Probably." The bluntness of it knocked the wind out of me. No grand villain speech, just a tired, practical probably. "But," he continued, the leather creaking as he shifted his weight, "killing you in here would ruin the upholstery, and I frankly lack the energy to drag your corpse out into the rain. So for the moment, you are safe." Something tossed through the dark and landed on my lap. I flinched, throwing my hands up to protect my face, but it was just soft cloth. "Press that against your knee," he ordered. "You tore it open on the courtyard stones. The smell of copper is giving me a migraine." I touched my knee. My fingers came away, slick and hot. In my panic, I hadn't even realized I was bleeding profusely. I picked up the cloth. It felt like pure, heavy silk, likely a handkerchief, worth more than my entire village, and pressed it hard against the gash. The pain finally registered, sharp and burning, making me hiss through my teeth. "Better," he murmured. We sat in silence. The carriage rattled on the wheels, singing a harsh, grinding song against the muddy road. The absurdity of the situation began to settle over me, heavy and suffocating. I had run from the wolf's den directly into the jaws of the alpha. "You're the tribute," he stated. It wasn't a question. Yes. I didn't see the point in lying. He had my scent now. He knew exactly what I was. "You run fast for a human with no shoes. Fear is a good motivator," I shot back. The words left my mouth before I could filter them. I immediately clamped my jaw shut, waiting for the reprimand. A human did not take that tone with an alpha, especially not a stray who had sneaked into his carriage. He didn't hit me. He actually let out a short, hollow laugh. It was a rough scraping sound. "Indeed it is," he said quietly. The air in the carriage was changing. When I first got in, it had been freezing. Now a dense, heavy heat was beginning to radiate from his side of the cabin. It wasn't the dry heat of a fireplace. It was the humid, oppressive heat of a living furnace. Werewolves burned hotter than humans. I shivered ironically cold despite the rising temperature, my wet dress clinging to my skin like ice. "Why did you leave?" I asked. The sheer audacity of the question shocked me, but the darkness offered a strange, false sense of equality. I couldn't see his fangs. I couldn't see his glowing eyes. I could only hear a tired man drinking wine. Silence stretched. For a long time I thought he wasn't going to answer, or that he would finally snap and punish me for speaking out of turn. "Because," Gideon said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its conversational tone. "If I stayed in that hall for one more minute, listening to my generals debate the slaughter of the southern territories, while they waited for me to rip the throat out of a terrified peasant girl, I would have killed them all." I stopped breathing. "I prefer the quiet," he added, taking another sip from his glass. "Though it seems you've ruined that for me too." The road smoothed out. The harsh rattling of cobblestones gave way to the soft, squelching sound of wheels cutting through deep mud. We were out of the keep. We had crossed the drawbridge. My heart did a strange, painful flutter. I was out, technically. But I was trapped in a wooden box with the most dangerous creature on the continent. The heat radiating from him was becoming intense. It was a primal, overwhelming warmth that made my wet clothes steam slightly in the freezing air. I was torn between inching closer to stop my teeth from chattering and pressing myself harder against the iron-reinforced door to get away from him. "You're still shivering," Gideon noted. "I'm soaked," I whispered back, my voice barely audible over the rain hammering the roof. I heard him shift. A heavy sigh, the sound of glass being set down on a wooden console. Then something large and heavy fell over me. It was the thick wool cloak I had initially hidden under. It smelled overwhelmingly of him musk pine and that sharp ozone scent of a coming storm. "Wrap it around yourself," he commanded. "If you die of hypothermia in my carriage, the smell of rot will be worse than the smell of blood." I didn't argue. I grabbed the edges of the cloak, pulling it tightly around my shoulders. It was absurdly warm, retaining the heat of his body. I buried my face in the collar, closing my eyes. For a split second, I let myself pretend I was just a girl on a journey wrapped in a warm blanket, safe from the monsters of the world. It was a pathetic, fleeting delusion. The carriage suddenly lurched, slowing down drastically. The driver pulled on the reins, shouting at the horses. My eyes snapped open. I clutched the cloak, my knuckles turning white. "Halt!" a voice bellowed from outside. It was a harsh, commanding bark. A border patrol. "State your business," another guard yelled. I froze, terror paralyzing my limbs. The border guards, the Alpha's personal military force. If they looked inside, they would see me. They would drag me out by my hair and throw me to the hounds. I looked toward the darkness where Gideon sat. I couldn't see him, but I heard the slow, even rhythm of his breathing. He wasn't panicked. He was annoyed. The driver spoke up, his voice trembling slightly. "You block the king's carriage, idiots. Step aside." There was a sudden, terrified silence outside, followed by the frantic splashing of boots in the mud. "My king, forgive us," the guard stammered. "We didn't know you were traveling tonight. We were told you were at the claiming ceremony." "Plans change, Captain." Gideon's voice rolled out from the carriage. He didn't yell, but the sheer force of his tone made the wood vibrate around me. "Why are you stopping my transport?" "The tribute, sire." The guard replied, his voice tight with anxiety. "The human girl. She escaped the armory holding cell. We have hounds tracking her scent toward the eastern woods, but protocol dictates we check all outgoing vehicles." My stomach plummeted. This was it. This was the moment. All he had to do was say, "She's in here." He wouldn't even have to lift a finger. He could just open the door and let them drag me away. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. I tucked my chin to my chest, preparing for hands to grab me. "You wish to search my carriage, Captain?" Gideon's voice was deathly quiet, a dangerous, lethal whisper that carried effortlessly over the storm. The silence outside was deafening. I could practically hear the guard sweating. No, my king," the guard stammered. "Of course not. We just... The girl is irrelevant." Gideon lied smoothly, and without a shred of hesitation. "A frightened mouse running into the jaws of the forest. Let the wolves hunt her if they wish. I have business at the southern garrison. Do not delay me further." "Yes, sire. Clear the road. Open the gates." The iron hinges of the massive border gates groaned in the distance. The carriage jerked forward, the horses eager to move again. We picked up speed, the wheels spinning faster, throwing mud against the undercarriage. I sat there, utterly paralyzed, the silk handkerchief still pressed to my bleeding knee, his heavy cloak wrapped around my shoulders. He didn't turn me in. He lied to his own guard, to his own military. Why? The question screamed in my mind, but I couldn't force it past my lips. I just stared blindly into the dark, my chest tight. "Don't flatter yourself," Gideon said softly into the pitch black, as if reading my mind. I flinched. "I didn't hide you to save you." He continued, the weariness returning to his voice, thick and heavy. "I hid you because if I let them open that door, I would have to listen to the captain grovel. I would have to deal with the paperwork of an executed runaway, and I would have to smell your fear while they dragged you out." It was a cruel, logical excuse, completely devoid of empathy, but it was a lie. I knew it was a lie. Because a werewolf's nose is thousands of times more sensitive than a human's. He claimed he didn't want to smell my fear. But the moment the guards approached, the moment my heart had spiked and my terror had flooded the tiny cabin. He had shifted his boot, just a fraction of an inch, pinning the hem of my ruined dress beneath his heel. It wasn't a threat. It was an anchor, a subtle physical grounding in the dark. I sat back against the door, pulling the cloak tighter. The Alpha King was a liar, and for the first time since the sun set, I felt a tiny, dangerous spark of curiosity ignite beneath my fear. "Where are we going?" I finally whispered. "Away," Gideon replied simply. The glass clinked against the console again. "Get some sleep, little human. If I decide to kill you in the morning, I'd prefer you rested. You look terrible." He didn't speak again. The only sounds were the rain, the turning wheels, and the deep, rhythmic breathing of a monster who had just stolen me from his own pack. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I watched the lightning flash through the window, catching glimpses of the dark trees whipping past us. I was a prisoner, an escapee, and a secret, all wrapped up in the heavy wool of the king's cloak. The fear was still there, sitting cold in my chest, but underneath it, warring with the survival instinct, was a strange, undeniable pull. I was in the carriage of the Alpha King, and he was running away too. Morning did not arrive with a gentle, rosy glow. It clawed its way through the cracked leather shades of the carriage, harsh and grey. Light is a cruel thing when you are hiding. It strips away the anonymity of the dark. My spine screamed as I tried to uncurl from the floorboards. Every muscle in my back felt as though it had been beaten with a mallet. My knee, where the heavy silk handkerchief had dried into the wound, pulsed with a hot, sickly ache. I tasted morning breath, stale adrenaline, and the lingering copper of my own bitten lip. I blinked against the intrusion of the grey light, my vision swimming into focus. The carriage was not a palace on wheels. In the light, the truth of it was jarring. The dark velvet cushions were worn bald in spots. The heavy iron fixtures were scratched, marred by deep parallel gouges that looked uncomfortably like claw marks. Empty glass bottles clinked sadly in a wooden rack by the door. It wasn't a king's royal transport. It was a cage, a mobile bunker. And then there was Gideon. He was asleep on the opposite bench, or at least his eyes were closed. In the daylight, the terrifying monster of the dark was replaced by something arguably worse, a fiercely real, profoundly exhausted man. He was huge. The dark linen shirt strained across his chest, the collar torn at the seam. He didn't look majestic. He looked like a veteran returning from a slaughter. A heavy dark shadow of stubble covered his jaw. The skin beneath his eyes was bruised purple with fatigue. Deep, jagged white lines, old scars cut through the tan of his throat, disappearing beneath his collar. One of his hands rested on his knee. The knuckles were raw split and crusted with dried blood that was definitely not mine. I pulled my knees tighter to my chest, making the wool cloak rustle. His eyes snapped open. There was no groggy transition from sleep to waking. 1 second, he was a dormant statue. The next, his gaze locked onto me with the terrifying, unblinking intensity of an apex predator. His irises were not entirely human. They were a pale, fractured amber, catching the weak morning light like cracked glass. I froze, trapped in the crosshairs. He stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. Then he rubbed a massive hand over his face, the sound of his palm against his stubble, loud as sandpaper. The amber retreated, settling into a dull, muddy brown. "You look exactly like a drowned rat," he croaked. His voice was thick with sleep rumbling low in his chest. "You don't look much better," I croaked back. My throat was so dry the words felt like swallowing dust. A heavy, tense silence filled the cabin. I expected him to lunge. I had insulted the Alpha King. But he just reached into a leather satchel near his boots, pulling out a metal canteen. He unscrewed the cap with his teeth, spat the cork onto the floor, and tossed the canteen at my chest. I scrambled to catch it, fumbling with my numb fingers. "Drink," he said, turning his head to look out the window. "We are stopping soon. The horses are half dead." I sniffed the opening of the canteen. It smelled of stale water and metal. I tipped it back and drank greedily, the cold liquid shocking my parched throat. Water dripped down my chin, mixing with the grime on my neck. I didn't care. I drank until my stomach felt heavy and sloshing. "Where are we?" I asked, wiping my mouth with the back of a filthy hand. "The northern ridge," Gideon replied. He didn't look at me. He was watching the dense, unforgiving pine forest whip past the glass. Far enough from the keep that the hounds will have lost the scent in the rain. Close enough to the border that the snows will start by midday. Snow. I looked down at my bare feet, blue with cold, and the ruined, mud-caked hem of my thin cotton dress. I was going to freeze to death before he ever got the chance to kill me. "What is your name?" he asked suddenly. The shift in topic was jarring. "Maeve," I muttered. "Maeve." He tested the syllables, his jaw ticking. "A lowlander name. Your parents were farmers." "Bakers," he scoffed, a harsh, bitter sound. "And they traded a baker's daughter to the wolves to keep the peace. How noble of the local magistrate." "It was a lottery," I snapped defensively, even though I hated the magistrate with every fiber of my being. I drew the short straw. Gideon finally turned his head. His eyes dragged over my pathetic, huddled form. The torn dress. The dirt. The dried blood. "There are no lotteries, babe," he said, his voice dropping into a register that made my ribs vibrate. "The magistrates pick the girls who have no brothers to avenge them and no dowries to be missed. They feed me the unwanted." The bluntness of it hit me like a physical blow. The air rushed out of my lungs. He wasn't wrong. My father was dead. My mother was sickly. I had no one to riot in the village square for me. I was disposable. Before I could formulate a response, the carriage began to slow. The grinding of the wheels shifted pitch, rolling over soft pine needles and uneven dirt instead of packed mud. "We stop here," Gideon announced. He cracked his neck, the joints popping violently in the small space. "Do not try to run. The driver is a loyal idiot with a crossbow, and the woods are full of bears that haven't eaten since autumn." He kicked the door open. Cold, biting mountain air flooded the cabin, smelling sharply of wet earth and pine sap. He stepped out without looking back. I sat there for a second, clutching the heavy wool cloak around my shoulders. The sheer absurdity of the situation washed over me again. I was Maeve, a baker's daughter, sitting in a scarred carriage, wearing the Alpha King's cloak, waiting to be ordered around like a disobedient hound. I braced my hands on the seat and forced myself to stand. My right leg buckled the instant my weight hit the floorboards. The gash on my knee had scabbed over, fusing the silk handkerchief to my skin. The movement tore it open again. A sharp, white-hot pain shot up my thigh. I bit down on a scream, grabbing the doorframe to keep from eating the floorboards. Outside the world was a sprawling canvas of grey and deep green. We were parked in a small, overgrown clearing, surrounded by towering, ancient pines. In the center sat a dilapidated logging cabin. The roof was sagging under a thick layer of wet moss, and the front door hung drunkenly on one rusted hinge. Gideon was already at the front of the carriage, speaking in low, clipped tones to Thomas, the driver. Thomas looked terrified, nodding furiously as he began to unhitch the exhausted, steaming horses. I took a deep breath, clutching the doorframe, and hopped down. My bare foot hit the freezing mud. It felt like stepping on a sheet of ice. I gasped, stumbling forward. Before I hit the dirt, a hand clamped around my bicep. It wasn't a gentle, romantic catch. It was a vice grip that nearly dislocated my shoulder. Gideon hauled me upright with zero effort, his fingers digging into my arm like steel bands. "I told you not to run," he growled, pulling me flush against his side to keep me from falling. "I didn't run," I hissed through my teeth, clutching my bleeding knee. My leg gave out. He looked down. His nostrils flared. The scent of fresh blood was in the air again. For a terrifying second, I watched the muscles in his jaw lock. The amber color bled back into his eyes, predatory and hungry. The beast beneath the skin was reacting to the smell of an injured prey animal. I stopped breathing. I pressed my hands against his chest, instinctively trying to push him away. He felt like a wall of solid stone. He blinked, shaking his head sharply. The amber vanished. He let go of my arm with a curse, stepping back as if I had burned him. "Get inside," he barked, pointing a scarred finger toward the sagging cabin. "Before you bleed all over the clearing and attract every scavenger within 5 miles. I didn't argue. I limped toward the cabin, using the thick cloak dragging behind me to wipe away my footprints. Every step was a battle. The cold mud sucked at my toes, and the wind bit right through the thin cotton of my dress wherever the cloak didn't cover. The inside of the cabin smelled of old ash rat droppings and damp, rotting wood. It was entirely one room. A rusted iron stove sat in the corner, and a crude wooden table lay splintered on the floor. It was a miserable place to die. Gideon ducked through the doorway behind me. He had to bow his head to clear the frame. He didn't look at me. He walked straight to the iron stove, dropping a heavy canvas sack onto the floor. "Sit on the crate," he ordered, not looking back. I found an overturned apple crate near the wall and carefully lowered myself onto it. I kept the cloak pulled tight up to my chin. My teeth were chattering so hard, my jaw ached. He moved with an efficient, brutal grace. He kicked the splintered table into smaller pieces with the heel of his boot, shoving the broken wood into the belly of the iron stove. He produced a flint and steel from his belt. 3 sharp strikes, and a spark caught the dry moss he had pulled from his pockets. Within minutes, a fire was roaring. The metal stove began to tick and ping as it heated up. Smoke billowed out of a crack in the chimney pipe, filling the small room with a thick, stinging haze. But the heat was glorious. Gideon turned away from the fire. He dragged the heavy canvas sack toward me. "Eat," he said, pulling out a hard block of cheese, a heel of stale black bread, and a dried, unidentifiable strip of meat. He tossed them onto my lap. I didn't care about manners. I didn't care that he was watching. The animal inside me, the purely human survival instinct, took over. I tore into the bread, chewing the hard crust until my jaw popped. I shoved the cheese into my mouth, nearly choking as I swallowed it dry. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. He watched me. He didn't lean casually against the wall. He stood rigid in the center of the room, his arms crossed over his chest. His eyes tracked my every movement. "You eat like a stray dog," he observed. "You try starving for 2 days in a holding cell." I shot back, mouth full of dry meat. The fear was ebbing, replaced by the reckless arrogance that comes from having a slightly full stomach and a warm fire. He didn't get angry. He just tilted his head. They didn't feed you. The guards said there was no point wasting good mutton on a girl who was going to be torn apart by midnight. Gideon flinched. It was a micro-expression barely there, but I saw it. A muscle in his cheek twitched. He looked down at his boots, the silence heavy and suffocating. "Take the cloak off," he said suddenly. My hands froze on the bread. My heart slammed into my ribs. "What?" "The cloak. Take it off." He stepped toward me, closing the distance in 2 long strides. "No." I shrank back against the rotting log wall, clutching the wool tighter to my throat. "Please." He let out an exasperated sigh, dropping to one knee in front of my crate. He was so close I could smell the leather of his jacket and the faint, coppery scent of his own dried blood. "I am not going to violate you, Maeve." He said, his voice flat, exhausted, and devoid of any emotion. "You are trembling, you are soaked to the bone, and your dress is holding the freezing water against your skin. You are going to catch pneumonia. Take the wet dress off, put the dry cloak back on, and let me look at your damn leg before it gets infected." I stared at him. The Alpha King. The monster of the North. He was kneeling in the dirt, offering to play nursemaid. It made no sense. None of it made sense. And that frightened me more than the howling in the courtyard had. I forced him to turn his back. He did so with an eye roll that was entirely too human. My fingers were stiff and clumsy as I untied the laces at the back of my ruined dress. The wet cotton clung to my skin like a second layer of freezing flesh. I peeled it off, shivering violently as the cold air hit my bare back and quickly dragged his heavy wool cloak over my head. It swallowed me whole, falling past my knees. It smelled intensely of him, that primal, overwhelming scent of pine and heat. "Done," I muttered, clutching the front closed. He turned around. In his hand, he held a small leather pouch. He knelt in front of me again, his massive frame blocking the heat of the stove. "Move your hands," he ordered. I slowly parted the cloak at the bottom, exposing my right knee. The silk handkerchief was glued to the skin with dried blood. The flesh around it was angry, swollen, and bruised a deep mottled purple. Gideon didn't wince. He unscrewed his canteen, pouring a splash of water over the silk to loosen the scab. I hissed my hands, gripping the edges of the apple crate. "Quiet," he murmured. His large, calloused fingers were shockingly gentle as they peeled the fabric away. He reached into the pouch, pulling out a clump of pungent, crushed green leaves. "This is wolfsbane root and yarrow. It's going to burn." Before I could protest, he pressed the poultice directly into the open gash. A scream ripped out of my throat. It felt like he had pushed a hot coal into my flesh. I kicked out instinctively, my heel connecting hard with his chest. He didn't even flinch. He just caught my ankle with his free hand, pinning my leg in place with terrifying ease. "Breathe," he commanded, binding a clean strip of linen tightly around my knee. "The pain means the rot is dying." I sat there, panting, tears leaking from the corners of my eyes. He tied off the bandage and finally let go of my ankle. He didn't stand up immediately. He stayed kneeling, his bloody hands resting on his thighs. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose door on its hinge. The sun had completely vanished behind thick, bruising snow clouds. The cabin was lit only by the angry orange glow of the stove. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. My voice cracked. The exhaustion was finally breaking through my defenses. Gideon looked at the fire, the flames reflected in his eyes. "Because I am tired of the smell of blood," he answered quietly. "That's a lie," I whispered. He snapped his head toward me. The sudden movement made me flinch backward. "You don't know anything about me, human," he growled. It was a real growl this time, a deep vibrating threat that rattled my teeth. "I know you left your own claiming ceremony," I pushed back. I couldn't stop. The fear was morphing into a desperate need to understand the creature holding my life in his hands. "I know your pack is probably tearing the keep apart right now looking for you. I know you lied to your own border guards. You are running." He stood up so fast he blurred. In a fraction of a second, his hand was clamped around my throat. He didn't squeeze. He didn't cut off my air. But the sheer weight of his hand, the heat radiating off his skin, pinned me to the wall behind me. His face was inches from mine. His eyes were pure blazing amber. His teeth had elongated sharp and white, pressing into his bottom lip. The monster was out. "Do not mistake my exhaustion for mercy, Maeve." He snarled, his breath hot against my face. "I am a killer. I have slaughtered armies. I have ripped men apart with my bare teeth. You are alive because I allow it. Do not push me." I stared up at him. My pulse beat frantically against his palm. I was terrified, truly deeply terrified, but I also saw his hand, the one holding my throat. It was trembling. The great Alpha King was shaking, not with rage, with a violent, desperate restraint. "You're tired." I whispered the words, slipping out of my mouth against my will. He froze. The amber in his eyes flickered, warring with the dark brown. "They expect you to be a monster tonight," I said, my voice shaking. "They want the blood. They want the hunt. And you just want to sleep." His chest heaved. The muscles in his jaw corded. For 10 seconds, the fate of my life hung in the balance of a werewolf's fractured psyche. Then he let me go. He stepped back, running both hands violently through his dark hair. He turned his back to me, bracing his arms against the wall above the iron stove, his head bowed. "It's the blood moon," Gideon said, his voice ragged, sounding as though it had been dragged over broken glass. "For 3 days, the beast sits at the front of the brain. It demands a hunt. It demands a kill. My generals, they gorge themselves on it. They lose their minds to the slaughter." He let out a hollow, agonizing laugh. "I have been king for 20 years. I have led 20 blood moon hunts, and every year it gets harder to put the beast back in the cage." He turned his head slightly, looking at me over his shoulder. The exhaustion in his face was devastating. "If I had stayed in that hall tonight, if I had looked at you terrified and bleeding on the floor, I wouldn't have been able to stop them. I wouldn't have been able to stop myself." He pushed away from the wall, collapsing heavily onto the floor near the stove, drawing his knees up and resting his arms on them. "I didn't run from the keep, Maeve," he whispered into the quiet cabin. "I ran from what I would do to you if I stayed." I sat frozen on my apple crate, clutching the heavy wool of his cloak. The wind screamed outside, slamming against the rotting logs. I was trapped in a cabin with a monster. But for the first time, I realized the monster was equally trapped, and the silence that stretched between us was no longer built on my terror, but on a dangerous, fragile understanding. Snow began to fall an hour later. It didn't drift gently. It drove hard against the rotting timber, hissing as it hit the hot iron pipe of the stove. Inside, the temperature plunged, but Gideon was burning alive. I watched from my crate as he paced the cramped room. The small space made him look enormous, a caged predator counting its steps. 3 paces to the wall, turn. 3 paces to the door, turn. His breathing was shallow, rapid. Sweat plastered the dark linen shirt to his chest, despite the freezing drafts slicing through the floorboards. The sun was completely gone. The blood moon had risen behind the storm clouds. "Get out," he rasped, halting abruptly. He didn't look at me. His hands were gripping the edges of the shattered table he hadn't burned. The wood splintered under his white-knuckled grip. "I'll freeze," I said. My voice was surprisingly steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Thomas has a heavy coat. Take one of the horses." His spine arched violently. A wet, sickening crack echoed in the cabin as a bone in his shoulder broke and instantly reset itself. He let out a low, guttural moan, dropping to his knees. "Go, Maeve. The fever is breaking my mind." I looked at the door. I looked at the dark, howling woods. If I walked out there, the cold would stop my heart in an hour. If I stayed, the monster might tear it out in 5 minutes. It was a miserable, cynical math. I stayed on the crate. "I'm not leaving." He snapped his head up. The man I had spoken to an hour ago was gone. His face was contorted, the jaw jutting forward, teeth elongating past his bottom lip. The amber in his eyes had consumed the brown, completely glowing, with a sickly radioactive light in the dim cabin. The smell of copper and hot earth filled the room, choking the air. "Run," he roared. It wasn't a human word. It was a sonic blast of pure animal fury that shook dust from the sagging roof. He threw himself backward, crashing against the far wall. He was trying to put distance between us. He dragged his claws down the timber, leaving deep, jagged gouges in the wood, fighting his own anatomy. Fear cold and absolute paralyzed my legs. My brain screamed at me to bolt, but my eyes locked onto his hands. They were violently clawing at his own temples, trying to tear the beast out of his skull. He was destroying himself to keep me safe. I stood up. My injured knee screamed, but I forced my weight onto it. The heavy wool cloak dragged against the dirt floor. Step by step, I crossed the room. He was curled in the corner, a massive, shuddering knot of muscle and bone. His growls were wet, heavy things. "Stop," I whispered. He snapped his jaws, a warning click of lethal teeth blind to everything but the bloodlust. I didn't reach out to pet him like a dog. I wasn't an idiot. Instead, I kicked his heavy leather boot with my bare, freezing foot. The physical jolt shocked him. He froze, his glowing eyes snapping to mine. He was panting drool, mixing with blood on his chin. "You said you were tired." I said, my voice harsh, stripped of any soft, comforting cadence. "So be tired. You are the king. Tell the beast no." He stared at me. The beast pushed against his skin, a physical distortion of his facial features warring with the sheer willpower of the man. The smell of ozone crackled in the air. I held my ground, though my knees were knocking together so violently I thought I might collapse. I didn't break eye contact. Slowly, agonizingly, his breathing hitched. The glowing amber flickered. He squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a long, ragged exhale that sounded like a dying bellows. The tension snapped. He collapsed forward, his forehead hitting the dirt floor. He didn't shift. The bones stopped grinding. The room fell utterly silent, save for the wind outside. I sank to the floor next to him, my back against the rough logs, pulling his cloak tighter around me. I didn't touch him. We sat in the cold dirt, two bruised, exhausted creatures who had barely survived the night. Hours bled away. The fire died down to glowing red embers. When the weak grey light of dawn finally seeped through the cracks in the walls, Gideon lifted his head. The amber was gone. Deep bruised exhaustion hollowed out his face. He looked at me, taking in my shivering form, the dirt on my face, the absolute ruin of my life. "You stayed," he rasped, his voice raw. "It was cold outside," I replied flatly. A slow, broken smirk pulled at the corner of his bloody mouth. It was a terribly human expression. Pragmatic to the end, Baker's daughter. He forced himself to sit up, his joints popping stiffly. He reached out his massive, scarred hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second, before he pulled the collar of the cloak tighter around my freezing neck. His knuckles brushed my collarbone. The touch was grounding. Real. "The snow will cover our tracks," Gideon said, looking toward the door. "But my generals will eventually figure out I didn't just go for a ride. They will hunt us both. Then I suppose," I said, staring at the dying embers of the fire, "we had better keep running." He nodded slowly. He didn't promise me safety. He didn't promise me a kingdom or a crown. He just promised me the road. And as he stood up, offering me a bruised, bloody hand to help me off the dirt floor, I took it. Did you enjoy this dark, grounded tale of survival and unexpected alliances? If Maeve and Gideon's tense journey kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit the like button. Share this video with your friends who love gritty fantasy romances. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more immersive, original stories. Your support helps bring these wild, raw worlds to life. See you next time.